Welcome to LAist Crawford Family Forum for the 2024 AirTalk Ballot Cram session. I'm Larry Mantle, joined by a terrific panel of experts who will take us through all 10 state ballot propositions and one local measure that would dramatically change LA County government. Now, for a more in-depth pro and con of each measure, please visit our LAist voter game plan at laist.com/vote. You'll find details on all the measures and audio of our AirTalk segments devoted to each one. With us, our expert panel this evening, Michael Alvarez of Caltech, where he's the Flintridge Foundation Professor of Political and Computational Social Science. Sarah Sadwani of Pomona College, where she's Assistant Professor of Politics. And Zachary Corser of Claremont McKenna College, where he directs the Policy Lab and is Associate Professor. Thank you all for being up for this. I know it's not the easiest. You're used to being able to expand on all of these, but we're going to go fast. So thanks so much. Let's take these in numeric order. We begin with Proposition 2. It's a $10 billion bond to fund capital projects at K through 12 schools and community colleges. The total repayment cost over 35 years would be $450 million beyond the $10 billion of the bond itself. Who'd like to start us off on Proposition 2? Zach?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. Well, essentially, since 1998, there's been a program called the School Facilities Program here in California, and the authorized funding for this is running out. Essentially, this is a matching fund for schools to update their facilities here in California. And so there's two things that are happening right now. One, funds are running out and they need to be reauthorized. And two, California has some pretty old school facilities. There was a UC Berkeley study that showed that 40% of California public school facilities are 50 or more years old. So that's why we're finding this on the ballot.
And air conditioning, I know, is one of the high priorities because as California gets warmer, some of the older schools in locations that historically weren't thought to need air conditioning are finding its help, particularly the school year is longer also. So that's yet another factor. So what critics of this say is it's yet more bonded indebtedness that the state's taking on, that much of this should be budgeted out of the general fund, as opposed to taking this on, plus with interest rates where they are, $450 million over the repayment period of 35 years is just, it's too costly. But the crux of the argument is a financial one, not that the work doesn't need to be done. Anybody want to add to that?
That's sir. Well, I think the one thing about this that is a bit different than last bond funding measures for public schools in particular is that it's going to change the allocation formula. It's going to require that the local municipalities, the local school districts, pony up a little bit. They're going to have to put some skin in the game to make this one work. And again, the downside to that, of course, is that that's going to require that they're going to go to their local voters, right, for additional funds and probably raise property taxes.
And one of the things the critic we had on AirTalk said is this money always ends up going to the better financed districts who can put together the proposals to put this to voters and to do the projects that the underfunded districts, they always end up with a hind part of bond measures like this.
And there are some parts of this measure that improve what are called hardship funding levels for low-income school districts, and there's also a more generous matching percentage if they can't manage to meet the minimum. It used to be $5 million. They're going to move it to $15 million now. So it's more generous to lower income school districts, but there are some people who are saying, who are opposing the measure, saying that it doesn't go far enough.
There is some money for charters, as I recall. Off the top of my head, I think it's about $300 million, something. So not a huge part of it, but that there is a small percentage that is allocated for charters in this measure. Sarah, anything just to add quickly on two?
I'll just jump in and add that, polling thus far looks like there is a majority of support for this measure. However, at the same time, other polling has shown that voters across California have really soured on the idea of additional government funding. And if we look back just to the primary election, Prop 1 that the governor was pushing for passed by a very narrow margin. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how this bond measure, as well as the other one that I'm sure we're going to talk about soon, how they're going to fare.
The other one's on on affordable housing and infrastructure. We'll get to that a little bit later, but we're taking these in numeric order on the ballot cram session. Proposition 3 replaces the language of 2008's voter-approved Proposition 8, which attempted to ban same-sex marriage in California. It was later struck down by federal courts, but the language remained in the state constitution. Prop 3 removes the language, "Only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California." It replaces that language with "The right to marry is a fundamental right." It adds that this is in furtherance of the constitutional rights to safety, happiness, and privacy, and the rights to due process and equal protection. Sarah, you want to start us on this? There's not a lot to say. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's
what
pretty
Prop 3 does.
straightforward. It would eliminate this language from the Constitution. It has a lot of broad support. This was brought forth by Assemblymember Evan Lowe from the Bay Area and has the support of both Equality California and Planned Parenthood, and notably has very little opposition against it. I think even amongst some conservatives who may want to oppose it, they've really stayed silent, recognizing that this is a very popular issue amongst Californians. I think polling found that 68% of likely voters intend to support the measure.
And in the opposition argument, the main argument was that the language here opens up the door for all kinds of marriages that are not sanctioned by the law, group marriages, things like that, which the proponents of this say is absolutely untrue, that the language would not do that. But that's what's referenced in the voter handbook. Quick comment from either of you before we wrap on
Again,
this.
I think Sarah summarized this quite well. I mean, this is what we call zombie language, right? It's a language that's in our state constitution. It's completely unenforceable. It's void. So
We probably have a lot of zombie language in the state constitution.
Yes, we do. But this is one to eliminate some of it.
All right, so that's Proposition 2. Proposition 3, we go to it next. It replaces the language of 2008, Proposition 4. My apologies. Proposition 4, a $10 billion bond to address climate risks and impacts. Funding would go to water treatment, wildfire prevention, heat mitigation, protections for wildlands, coastal areas, and wildlife. There would be funding for renewable energy. The repayment cost of Proposition 4 would be $400 million over a 40-year term. That's on a $10 billion bonds worth of borrowing. Proposition 4, Zach, you want to start us on that?
Yeah, I think this proposition is really about mitigating and creating resilience to climate change. We're no strangers, unfortunately, to, for instance, increasing home insurance prices, wildfires. We can really see the evidence and the impact in California's economy and its environment of climate change. And this is geared towards trying to work on water resources in particular, but also, caring for and trying to make California more resilient to climate change.
All right. Michael?
This is our opportunity in California to make the single largest investment in mitigating climate change in the state. And I think it's a very exciting ballot measure. And as far as I know, at this point in time, it's got pretty strong support in most polling.
One of the challenges is the oversight of how the money is spent, because, as you know, there's criticism of a number of the federally funded renewable energy projects, that there's been a lack of oversight for things like heat mitigation that's included here, for example. I've heard concerns expressed over, well, how are you tracking that this is really, you're getting bang for the buck and how the money is allocated? So there's so much here for climate-oriented issues. I think one of the things that concerns people beyond just the additional indebtedness here is, what is the degree of oversight? And Sarah, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I mean, I think there's a lot of jockeying of lobbyists behind the scene on this climate measure. At least that's kind of the chatter that we're hearing of who exactly is going to wind up getting some of these funds. One of the things that has happened, of course, is California has set a number of climate goals and standards, but in the last year or so, we've faced a budget deficit, and so we haven't been able to fund many of those initiatives. So this climate bond measure is really seen as a way of moving that forward.
In the wildfire, we've seen one of the biggest unbudgeted expenses in recent years in California has been in wildfire prevention and fighting of these huge wildfires. So there is mitigation money for wildfires, for clearing, controlled burns, things like that are a part of the bond measure. Michael?
Well, and I would just point out again, you can tell I'm actually someone in favor of this measure, but just think about what would happen if some of these climate mitigation measures work, right? They're going to prevent wildfires, they're going to help improve the quality of the water we face or we drink, and so I think that, again, if you think about it from that point of view, it's a great investment.
Again, it's $400 million. The repayment cost over 40 years. The total borrowing would be $10 billion on the bond for climate. That's Proposition 4. Let's talk about Proposition 5. Proposition 5 is next. It lowers the threshold for passing local bonds for affordable housing or public infrastructure. Currently, 2/3 of voters must pass those bonds. Proposition 5 would require 55% support as the threshold instead, and it would allow local governments to raise property taxes above 1% to repay those bonds. So again, this has already happened with school bonds, right? That was already, local districts can pass with 55% there. This would extend this to affordable housing and infrastructure. Who'd like to elaborate on this? Zach?
Sure. I mean, this is hand in hand with the idea that California is experiencing a housing crisis, and there's many obstacles to building affordable housing. And so this is seen as giving these measures that localities want to put on the ballot to fund these kinds of housing-related measures a better chance of passing, because this was Prop 39 back in 2000 that lowered the threshold to 55% for school bonds. And over that period of time, 80% of school bond measures have passed. So it increases the likelihood of passage by about 30%, maybe a slightly less. So it really does make a difference in terms of the likelihood of these passing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I asked the proponent who came on Air Talk, well, you're saying that the 2/3 is undemocratic to allow a minority to stop a bond from passing. Then why 55%? Why not 50? And very pragmatic response, we thought this had a much better chance of passing. So makes sense. Sarah?
Yeah, I would just add, there was actually supposed to be a bond measure from the city of San Francisco for $20 billion for affordable housing. It actually got pulled from the ballot because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to pass this 2/3 threshold. So if passed, these kinds of measures would likely be able to move forward a little bit more easily. But as of right now, that bond measure is no longer appearing on the ballot.
My understanding is also that for any measures that did stay on the ballot, this would apply, which is, I think, uncharacteristic. In the past, it would only be for the next election. This would apply here, this one.
Correct.
Right. Yeah, that's some interesting language, and I just was wondering about the legality of that, but I don't really know. The interesting thing here too is that this is, as you pointed out earlier, just another effort to continue the process of chipping away at Prop 13, the old Prop 13, the original Prop 13.
With the ability to also raise the property taxes
To raise
above
property
1%.
taxes, absolutely, yes.
All right, so that is Proposition 5, changing the threshold from 2/3 to 55% to pass local affordable housing and public infrastructure bonds. You're listening to the Ballot Cram session. We're coming your way from the Crawford Family Forum at LAist 89.3. I just want to remind you, in case you joined us, that this program is available online as a part of our voter game plan at laist.com/vote. Also, the in-depth conversations on every one of these ballot measures you'll find there from all of our AirTalk segments on the ballot props, as well as candidate interviews and the wonderful work that our LAist staff has done putting together the in-depth voter game plan. You'll even find the judges' races in Los Angeles County, the background on the judges at laist.com/vote. All right, Proposition 6 is next. Proposition 6 amends the state constitution to ban compelled work from incarcerated Californians. Those in prison could still choose to accept work assignments in exchange for credit to reduce their sentences. Currently, the state constitution bans involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. This would remove that exception. Michael, you want to start on Proposition 6?
Well, I think you summarized it quite well. It's pretty straightforward, right? It's basically going to prohibit slavery and involuntary servitude as punishment for crime in California, That's pretty straightforward.
And I don't think that there's even a ballot argument against this in this case.
No, not that I'm aware of. And I think the opening language is quite telling. Slavery is prohibited. I think in 2024, we can probably all agree with that, but maybe aren't necessarily always thinking about how that actually comes into play within the prison system and amongst incarcerated people.
Well, and when we had the debate on this on AirTalk, we had some listeners who said, well, you know, for people that are incarcerated, we spend a lot of money for them to be fed and to be housed in prison. They're there as a result of their actions. It's not unfair to expect them to do some work towards the housing and feeding of them while they're in prison. So there may not be a formal ballot argument, but it doesn't mean that there isn't some opposition to it. Zach?
Yeah, and it's interesting to compare some other states that have made the same move. You wouldn't exactly think of them as, red or blue states when I look at this list here. Alabama, for example, and Tennessee have ended involuntary servitude as a punishment in 2022. So, California may be becoming an outlier on this issue in some way. And I think another way to think about this, too, is minorities are disproportionately imprisoned in California. For example, black men and women are 28% and 23% of prisoners, while they only make up 6% of the state's population. And so they're disproportionately affected by involuntary servitude in prison.
Sarah?
I'll just going back to your other point, and it's not that I necessarily support this or not, but I will just offer that the Legislative Analyst Office did put together an assessment of Proposition 6 if it were to be enacted, and it said that the cost structure is really uncertain, that it's unclear exactly to what extent this would increase costs, because now the expectation is for incarcerated people, if they are doing work, that they would be paid and perhaps paid more. So that report really shows it could potentially be costing us millions of dollars down the road.
I guess the open question is, how many incarcerated Californians are working because they're compelled versus because they want the credits, or it's low pay but want the pay that they do get for doing the work. So there may not be a drastic drop in the prison workforce as a result of this. I guess that's what they're saying is unknown.
One thing that surprised me is, given the fact that there's not really any organized opposition, the last Public Policy Institute of California poll from September actually shows this measure failing with few undecideds. Right now it's 46% support, 50 against, and 3 undecided. So this might be a trend here on tough on crime this year from California voters.
That's Proposition 6 that we're talking about. You're listening to the Ballot Cram session on LAist 89.3. This is something AirTalk does every 2 years, where we, in rapid fire, go through all of the state ballot propositions. This year, we're adding Los Angeles County Measure G to the state props. We continue. Next up is Proposition 32. It would increase the state minimum wage from $16 to $18 an hour. It would be staged up depending on the size of the employer. So larger companies would have to increase more rapidly than smaller ones, but it would bring it up to $18 an hour within 2 years for all employers. It would annually adjust the minimum wage for inflation, which I don't think we've ever had in California. It's always been through legislative action that it's been increased, at least in my memory. So this would allow for an up to 3.5% increase based on inflation. It would be capped at 3.5%. Again, this is fairly straightforward in what it does, but it's a very divisive proposition with many business owners in the state very concerned about what this means for their bottom line, and even whether they're going to have to lay off people to meet this. Proponents of it say, well, that's always what's claimed, but that's not what happens. One of the things interesting to look at is the recent fast food employee raise, which went into effect. And there, the most recent numbers I've seen actually show increasing numbers of people working in fast food. Again, we don't know how much of that is related to other demands in the business sector. Sarah, you want to take this on?
Yeah, sure. And in addition to more people working in the fast food industry, there's reports that have shown an increase in prices, given the rise in the minimum wage for fast food workers. And I think a lot of folks are thinking about this year in particular, where the economy and kitchen table issues are on the minds of so many voters when we're thinking about up and down the ballot from president to all the way down to these propositions. So this increase in the minimum wage could, as the opponents say, bring an increase in those costs that folks are facing each and every day.
And I think we have seen somewhat of an increase in automation in fast food, but not as much as, at least immediately, as what had been warned with the passage of the fast food higher minimum wage. So I guess we're going to have to see how much of it is really economically automated here or in other fields of work. Michael?
Yeah, I was going to say this is continuing a trend. Back in 2016, the legislature passed and the governor signed Senate Bill 3, which moved the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And I do think, to go back to something you said earlier, I'm pretty sure that SB 3 does peg.
It has a cost
it
of
does
living
have a cost of
increase?
living increase
All right.
pegged to the CPI.
Yeah, do you
And
know
this
if
would
there's-
have it the same.
So this would be the same
This would-
cap, the same
Exactly,
CPI.
the same sort of process, and there's also the adjustments for the
Right.
size of the company, 25 or 26 or more.
Very good.
Goes quickly, and lower than 25, it moves.
They have more
slowly.
time
Yeah.
to raise it. Zach, quick comment on this?
Yeah, just quickly, I want to talk about Joe Sandberg, because there's a whole controversy about this dating back to 2022, where this almost got on the ballot in another form. And Joe Sandberg, he's a wealthy entrepreneur, owns an investment in an online banking company, and he's really the prime mover behind this initiative. And in 2022, he failed to qualify in time to get enough signatures for the ballot, and he sued over this, and he's come back again and has qualified this time. But if you look at the fundraising, it's really his measure. He gave $10 million out of $11.4 million to
Wow.
this measure. So I know he's got some ambitions to run for president. I know this is sort of part of his political vision to do this, but he's an example of one of these wealthy Californians that are stepping into the initiative process.
He's the one who spoke with us on the initiative on AirTalk. So if you want to actually hear him talk about the measure that he is the sponsor of, you can hear that at LAist.com/vote on the voter game plan under Proposition 32. Again, minimum wage would be increased from $16 to $18 an hour and annually adjust for inflation. We have another Proposition 33, which would allow cities and counties to expand rent control to single-family homes, condominiums, units constructed since 1995, and new renters. Those current exemptions are all part of what is called the Costa-Hawkins Act of 1995. So what Proposition 33 does is repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act, enabling cities and counties to put in these more far-reaching rent control measures than are currently allowed. This is an initiative, we're just talking about the sponsor of Proposition 32. Proposition 33 is sponsored by a frequent sponsor of initiatives on the California ballot, AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and they're involved with another ballot measure that's aimed at them that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Michael, you want to start us on Proposition 33?
Well, this is the third time. This has been on the ballot. It was on the ballot in 2018 and 2020. And many of you, probably if you watch TV, like I was watching football over the weekend, and it's drilled into my brain now, the slogan, the damn rent is too damn high. So that they're really out there in the airwaves right now. Again, this would basically roll back the Costa-Hawkins legislation from 1995, which would allow local governments, municipalities, and counties to start to move towards imposing rent control. It's very controversial, and this is an interesting one because I looked the polling up on this one, and the most recent poll comes from Berkeley's IGS just at the end of September. 37% yes, 36% no, and 27% undecided, which is really pretty remarkable. 27% of people saying they're undecided on this measure.
Well, part of that may be the ads because the proponents, or I should say the opponents of the measure, bill this as removing rent control, as repealing rent control. Well, it would essentially override Costa-Hawkins, but the advocates are claiming it would allow rent control to be expanded. But that's not how it's being depicted. I'm not saying that to be critical. That's your job when you're running a political ad. But that's how they're framing
Yeah,
it.
they're trying to confuse people because if you
So-
confuse people in a ballot measure, they vote against it.
So, Zach?
I think it's a really interesting combination of interests in the sense is you've got AIDS healthcare on one side with the California Nurses Association, a few others. But if you look at opposition, you've got some unlikely bedfellows here. You've got the California Republican Party. You've got California YIMBY. You've got State Assembly person Buffy Wicks. Some very pro-housing people are against this measure. And I think there's an argument being made, an economic argument being made, that this would be a curb on building new housing at a time when California needs as many incentives as possible to build housing. So AIDS healthcare is kind of out there alone. And as we talk about the next measure, we'll get some ideas about the reaction to this campaign. Because I think Democrats, pro-housing types, they're not very supportive of this measure.
Well, and I would include many economists who are in fact very pro-housing and even progressive in a lot of their other things, are concerned that extending rent control, that does depress housing starts. And I know that's a very lively debate in housing economics. Sarah?
Yeah, just to jump in, I would just remind us that, of course, housing and homelessness is one of the top issues that has been on the minds of California voters for the last several years because of the ongoing crisis, both in terms of the number of people that are on the streets, but also just the stock of affordable housing. And so when we have a proposition like this, you're absolutely right, Larry, the opponents come in quite strong, saying, and many of those opponents being funded by large corporate housing landlords, saying, this will also hurt the mom and pops out there as well, because it opens the floodgates to the various kinds of rent control. And certainly this has been an ongoing topic, even within LA City Council, of how do we provide support for people who might be facing eviction from a mom and pop landlord who just have one unit or a few units that they're trying to make ends meet as well.
And I think one important thing to say is this would not require cities and counties.
Correct.
And they could pick and choose among these. So for example, if they felt like, well, landlords need to catch up a bit with a new tenant, we're not going to extend rent control to someone who's moving in because we assume they're not necessarily as reliant on staying where they are, so we will exempt them. My understanding is they would have that latitude under this that they currently can't pick and choose. Zach?
And in politics, like a lot of things, timing is everything. Now, the last two attempts at similar measures failed by 20%. It wasn't even close. But the polling shows that this potentially could pass. I think housing is top of mind. I think people are getting desperate about the cost of housing in California, and they're frustrated about lack of activity. And this seems like a way to make a dent in the housing crisis in a sort of one singular way. So, and this is also the biggest spending measure by far. There's been $100 million on both sides spent on this. So,
as we can see from the ads.
Yeah, as we can see from the ads.
Yeah, in the middle of the night while I'm sleeping, one seems to, they're just omnipresent. Yeah. So that's Proposition 33, again, which would override the Costa-Hawkins Act of 1995 and the exemptions that are included in that. You're listening to the Ballot Cram session of AirTalk. We do it every 2 years, take you all through California's ballot props. And this year, we're also bringing you Measure G in Los Angeles County. We continue with the measure I mentioned is aimed squarely at AIDS Healthcare Foundation. It's Proposition 34. It would require any organizations that exactly fit the description of AIDS Healthcare Foundation to spend 98% of its revenues from discount prescription drug programs on direct care of patients. That would make it extremely difficult for AIDS healthcare to fund the many housing-related ballot measures that we see with just about every run of propositions. Let me just tell you how it's restricted. It applies to those spending over $100,000 and who operate multifamily housing with high-severity violations. One organization, apparently, that this would apply to. Some call it a revenge bill for all the legislation that AIDS Healthcare puts on. So is there anything else needs to be said about this, Sarah?
I'll just add that this is supposedly a proposition about funding for patient care or health care, and yet the major sponsors putting millions and millions of dollars behind this measure is the California Apartment Association and the Realtors Association, not exactly organizations that have a whole lot to do with patient care.
I think this is where we earn our pay for the week, is trying to decode this one. So if we want to dig down to what this is all about, it's really about Medicaid's 340B drug pricing program. It's implicated in two senses. One is that Governor Newsom, by executive order, changed the way in which the state goes about negotiating for drug prices to take advantage of this, so that California can realize more savings and have a ability to negotiate with drug manufacturers to get better prices for Medicaid in California, for Medi-Cal. It also so happens that the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is a beneficiary. They're the ones who actually buy these drugs and sell them back, and they get to keep the difference. And it's become increasingly profitable over time. The differentiation between what you can negotiate and what you sell for.
So that's how they fund
wider,
these expensive campaigns.
has become wider and wider. And recently, about 2017, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation decided to get more into housing policy in particular. And that's why we've seen these these housing initiatives come that were funded primarily by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. They've also sponsored a lot of other kinds of direct democracy initiatives related to housing. Even in Ohio, they're very active. And so the idea is, how do you prevent AIDS Healthcare from taking the profits they're making from the 340B program and have them spend it on things like direct democracy campaigns? And that's really at the heart of what this is about. I think the Newsom part of this, the change, the executive order, it's a feint. It kind of gives an idea that what this is really about negotiating for lower drug prices. But ultimately, the major effect of this would be to take AIDS healthcare out of the picture in terms of coming back with, for instance, if the rent control measure fails, maybe coming back in a couple of years with another.
They wouldn't be able to fund that. If
They wouldn't.
Yeah. All right, that is Proposition 34. Next up, Proposition 35, which would make permanent a current tax on managed care insurance programs for Medi-Cal patients. Now, Medi-Cal is for lower-income Californians. It's what we call the Medicaid program at the federal level. So all the revenue raised from that tax must be used for Medi-Cal services. So the proponents of this say this is really necessary to raise the reimbursements that providers get for treating Medi-Cal patients. One of the big problems is the state has expanded its Medi-Cal subscribers is that as the reimbursements haven't risen to the level that the providers think they should, it's led to a very narrow network of Medi-Cal providers. So difficult. You can get Medi-Cal coverage, you qualify, but then finding a doctor can be extremely difficult. So this would also keep the legislature from redirecting funds from the tax so that they could potentially reimburse providers at a higher level. Sarah, you want to start on this one, or?
Yeah, I think I have to say that Los Angeles Times recently said no on this proposition, and I can certainly understand why. They say it's ballot box budgeting, that this proposition is such granular policy around Medi-Cal funding that it simply should not be on the ballot. And I have to say, even in preparing for today, I had to spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out what on earth this proposition is about. And I wanted to point also to some of the opposition against it. Certainly the supporters include Planned Parenthood, the California Medical Association, but on the opposition it includes the League of Women Voters, the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network that has some real equity concerns about the impact of this, Courage California, and a host of local health advocates who say that this measure is really going to impact the ability for people to use Medi-Cal for at-home care, a part of that is incredibly needed for many people who are unable to leave their homes. So many of them, while they were not listed on the ballot as opposing this measure, have come forward to oppose this at this point in time.
Michael, Proposition 35.
Well, I'm going to editorialize about 34 and 35 for a second because, I love living in California. I love the ballot measure process. I love these things. I think it's great that we as citizens get to decide measures of public policy. However, these two cases, 34 and 35, neither of these should be on the ballot, right? 34 is weaponizing our proposition process, and 35 is so complicated, Zach. You said 34 was where we were going to earn our living tonight. I had to spend a couple of hours trying to understand this. It's very complicated, and it does strike me as something that should be left to the legislature.
All right. Zach?
Yeah, and also to say, if you just look at the campaign financing, California hospitals donated $15 million, California Medical Association $9 million. I think it's really you can see this as a benefit in the sense that if you can increase access to Medicaid, bring more providers in, and improve care, that's positive. But you can definitely see that the interests are here in driving
It's
this
the
measure.
providers, yeah. And they're billing this as this is going to help Medi-Cal recipients.
That's right.
That's right. But of course, it's about ultimately getting them paid more to provide that care.
Indeed.
All right. That is Proposition 35. Proposition 36 essentially repeals the most controversial parts of 2014's Proposition 47. 36 would allow felony prosecutions of repeat lower-level theft and drug offenders. Currently, for property crimes of less than $950, no felonies can be charged. 36 would allow felony prosecution if someone has 2 prior convictions for lower-level theft. It would also restore what's called drug court, which was very popular within some parts of the criminal justice system, but unpopular with some who believe that using the threat of incarceration to compel people to go to drug rehabilitation is not the best way to accomplish that goal. So this would restore drug courts where a judge would, in circumstances of someone being prosecuted for a drug violation, the judge could compel the person to go to rehab in lieu of going to jail or to prison. We're going to take a little bit more time on this one. It's highly substantive, and back when Proposition 47 passed, I remember someone who's been doing this for decades. My thought was, gosh, I wonder how long before we have the pendulum swing back, because over my 40 years, we've seen the pendulum go back and forth, and mandatory minimum sentences, and we have all kinds of swings on this. Zach, you want to start on what this would do?
Sure. Well, there's a long list of things, but I think we should sort of frame this at the beginning to say this has really been driven by images we've seen in the media. These gangs, organized gangs, and retail thefts. The idea of the smash and grab that's been happening across the state. I think voters are getting the feeling that, particularly at the retail level, Prop 47 may not have worked. And I think law enforcement has been very critical of 47. I think they've, and if you look at the interests that are supporting this, we've got the California Sheriff's Association, California Police Association, California District Attorneys Association. I mean, California law enforcement really is looking to alter and change how we deal with drug crimes and retail theft. And I think this is an attempt to do so. Did 47, first of all, cause this problem? I think is kind of an open question. I think it's just sort of people assume that it did, but I don't know that the facts necessarily back that up. I think it's what people feel it's true, but I don't know that it is true. But essentially, it's going to turn the clock back in a number of ways. For example, make most drug possession crimes misdemeanors rather than felonies is something that Prop 47 did. This is going to change things around. It's going to make penalties harsher. It's going to bring felonies back into the way we treat this. It's going to treat fentanyl more harshly because we've seen so many fentanyl deaths,
overdoses, yeah.
So many overdoses to treat that. So, this is playing out too in California politics, where you see a lot of also local, even Democrats, like, for instance, San Francisco Mayor London Breed. San Francisco has been in the headlines repeatedly for retail thefts. She's supporting this.
Zach, I was going to say, I do think the images are part of this, but I think there are other things going on too. And that is people go into their local drugstore and see everything locked up. Mm-hmm. All of us have witnessed, I can't imagine there's anyone in this room who hasn't witnessed shoplifting. It's so common now that to see someone run out of your neighborhood store with something and someone chase after them is an everyday occurrence. And so I think the retail theft issue is so top of mind because we're just so exposed to the effects of that. And the retailer's claim is it's not even worth their time because it'll get written up as a misdemeanor. No one's going to be prosecuted for it. It's labor on the part of the stores, so they're taking it as a loss. We see supermarket prices going up. Who knows how much of that's, directly related. I don't mean to blame that on it, but we make those associations. And I think that's also a big driver of this. I'm curious anyone else's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, Larry. And I think that we're talking about the pendulum swinging, and wow, has it swung. If we compare even 2024 to 2020, in that election, we were coming off of the George Floyd protests. Criminal justice was at the top of people's minds. And this is playing out in a host of other elections as well. Here in Los Angeles County, of course, we have the district attorney's race, which, between Nathan Huckman and George Gascon, these are very similar kinds of issues that people have at the top of their mind when making these decisions. Notably, on this Prop 36, the PPIC poll from September found that 71% of likely voters said that they would vote yes on this measure, which is most certainly a suggestion of a real swing of that pendulum.
Yeah, that's going to be a tough margin for the opponents to overcome in just the few weeks before the election. Michael, your thoughts on Prop 36?
Well, I think that when I think back on this, I think back to 2014. And what the issue then was that we had incredibly overcrowded prisons in the state, and many of the people who were in prison and incarcerated were Black and Latino. And so what we were trying to do back then was trying to roll back some of these penalties so that we could deal with the prison overcrowding and deal with some of those racial inequities. But again, I do think that the pendulum has changed, that I think politically now we see this every day. We see it on the news certainly every day. And again, I think Sarah's obviously right about the polling. I do think that this is likely to pass.
And I haven't heard that the percentage of white or Asian American incarceration has gone up to change that ratio during the 10 years since. Have you?
That I don't know.
I'm curious.
No,
I
don't
don't know if the racial disparities may still be there under Proposition 47. I'm not sure if that has shifted. I did want to just briefly talk about drug court, because this is a very controversial aspect of this. And you've got people who absolutely love the drug court idea and say that for many people, the hitting bottom that really gets them into successful rehab is the threat of going to jail or going to prison. And then you've got others. It's kind of a philosophical difference here. And other people say that's no way to get people into rehab because people's heart's not going to be in it if you do that. I'm just curious your thoughts on kind of how the public respond, or maybe that's not even from a public standpoint a major part of this.
Well, I think research shows that, for instance, in Hawaii, where this really initiated, that these drug courts are actually quite effective in stopping recidivism, but also getting people unaddicted to drugs. So I think it's not a bad idea. The idea here is that this will mandate that those who are convicted of certain drug crimes be given a choice. You can either go to treatment and have your charges dismissed, or have a felony charge and up to 3 years. And I think, it sounds harsh, but at the same time, if you go through treatment and the charges could be dismissed, I think that could really change a lot of people's lives for the positive. And I think the social science tends to show that this has been a positive change.
Well, and if people go to prison for 3 years, they might have access to drugs. I mean,
Indeed.
Drugs do get in there, but there's not necessarily a guarantee it would be at their desired level either. So, I mean, there's just so much here packed into one. And Michael, you were talking about propositions that have sort of too much and are too complex. Does this one fall into that for you or not?
It does. It's not too complex in the sense that it has things stuck in it that don't really make sense. But it's really complicated. It's got a lot of moving parts. For example, I was trying to figure out with the drug courts exactly what the funding mechanism is too. It's not clear to me where the funding for the treatment programs comes. Again, it may be there. I mean, I was trying to read through the fine print, but it's a very complicated measure that's got a lot of moving parts.
All right, that's Proposition 36. And our final ballot measure to talk about is Los Angeles County Measure G. It does multiple things as well. And that's to the consternation of two critics on the LA County Board of Supervisors. But the 3-member majority of the board put this on the LA County ballot. It would expand the number of supervisors from the current 5 to 9. It would create a county-wide elected executive position, kind of like a county mayor. It would also create an ethics commission for Los Angeles County, and each of the county departments would have to present their budget in an open Board of Supervisors session so that the public could respond to the budget priorities. That's all in Measure G. Sarah, you want to start on this?
Our expert.
Sure. And I think I want to just be clear that I'm actually listed as a supporter of Measure G. So yeah, Measure G is really meant to increase transparency and accountability at the Board of Supervisors. And there's so many different pieces of this that we can kind of go into further depth. Let's start perhaps with the board expansion. I've been working on a research brief. People have been talking about expanding the Board of Supervisors since the 1920s, and yet it has never happened. We have 5 members who allocate a nearly $45 billion with a B dollar budget for a county of nearly 10 million people. That is a whole lot of power for a county governance, which at one point in time was really just seen as some extension of the state and not really very significant. It's awfully significant today, and having additional representation could help in providing additional transparency and bringing those legislators closer to the people they serve. Their districts currently have nearly 2 million people in them. This would bring them closer to the size of a state Senate district, around 1 million, which is still large. But there's also a commission that would be formed to continue to look into the future at whether or not additional expansions would be necessary. And I'll pause there.
Yeah, okay. So let me say, one of the things that the 2 supervisors, Holly Mitchell and Catherine Barger, say about it is, there's no funding for this. So the argument is, well, what do? You're going to cut the budget of a supervisor in half so that you can fund the expansion? You're going to cut the salary of the supervisor in half? There's nothing to fund this. And the proponents say, no, we'll take this from the current budget operating this branch of county government, not elsewhere, but from the Board of Supervisors to fund this. And the critics say that's not realistic. That just can't really happen. So how would you respond to that, Sarah?
There would certainly be a need to shift some of this personnel to support new supervisors and the new county CEO. So you're right, it would require some cuts to those individual budget board members' budgets. Rather than having over 100 staff members, maybe each Board of Supervisor has fewer members. So it would require a reallocation of how the money that is used for the administration of the Board of Supervisors gets spent.
All right.
Yeah.
Michael.
So I came to Pasadena, I think in the early 1990s, and the Star News asked me to start writing op-eds. And one of the first op-eds I wrote was to do something exactly like this.
With all of
like
these,
30 years ago.
all of these parts to it?
Basically expanding, because I was shocked when I moved here to find out that the Board of Supervisors had only 5 representatives. It's just shocking when you think about it. It's a legislative body. And at that size, it just does not
How
provide.
many does New York have? Some massive number of
Sarah
people
would know.
with all the
It's
boroughs?
huge.
Yeah.
Well, that would be the New York City Council.
Yeah.
But I mean, San Francisco has 11, Chicago has 17. So there's plenty of comparatives. None of those cities are as large as
LA County,
As
yeah.
LA County.
Right, but the other point, actually, Sarah was at a roundtable that we had at Caltech recently, and the point that Sarah raised too is that the executive part of this too is really important.
Yeah.
Because the County Board of Supervisors right now really lacks any kind of checks and balances, right? And so what the executive would do is help provide some additional checks and balances on the power of the Board of
Well,
Supervisors.
how does the LA mayor provide a check and balance on the LA City Council, given all the corruption we've seen with the City Council? How does that work?
Well, it also depends a bit, and this is, I think, where the issues about the allocation of staff and budgets come in, right? Because you do need to make sure that this new executive has a sufficient staff and a sufficient budget, right, to actually provide those checks and balances. I know nothing about how LA City works, so I can't speak to that. I'll let Sarah speak to that one.
Well, and just to say, as an executive, they would have a veto. So they could be overridden by, a majority of the supervisors, but nonetheless, it brings a kind of an executive energy in where you've got to, have more checks and balances between the executive. But I think it's maybe the most untested part of this is how exactly an elected county executive would work. You know, what kind of people would it attract? How would this work with the supervisors?
I think the budget, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, actually would go through the elected executive before going to the soups. Isn't that the case?
That's correct. Similar to how the process works for the city. The mayor of the city of Los Angeles gives a proposed budget, and then the city itself actually goes through it with a fine-tooth comb and makes cuts to it or adds money to various pieces. So you have multiple eyes looking at it in a very transparent process that ordinary Angelenos should hopefully be getting involved with and better understanding where that goes. I want to just add to Michael's point here, currently the Board of Supervisors is both an executive and a legislative branch. And an executive branch, if we think about it, all of us, especially if you were raised here in the United States and took, U.S. history, we typically think of checks and balances as the way in which we operate U.S. democracy and governance. That an executive branch provides a separation of power from a legislative branch. So, what is the energy that an executive branch brings? Well, it often is setting the agenda and telling the supervisors, send me these kinds of proposals. Right now, there's really no checks or balances. For a very long time, the Board of Supervisors was known as Five Little Kings because there had never been a female to serve on it. Now it's known as the Five Little Queens.
Yeah, I wouldn't call them little either. Yeah. They're formidable.
Absolutely, they sure are.
These are very strong elected officials. Yeah. Final thought on this, and we'll wrap up. Measure G, LA County.
It may very well be time. I think since 1912, which was the passage of the LA Charter, we've really never made a major revision, and it's certainly time to consider it. And I'm from Claremont, which is a town of about 34,000 that's governed largely the same way as the LA Board of Supervisors, in the sense it's a council manager kind of model where you've got 5 people serving. They're essentially performing both roles, executive and legislative, and then they've got a city manager to carry out, and that's kind of the model we have at the county level. Sounds like, with 10 million people and a $45 billion budget, it may be time for a change to increase the amount of representation, to bring more checks and balances in. I think, we in Los Angeles County should give this serious consideration.
If it passes, there's still going to be a lot to figure out with the financing of it, obviously. The point you raised, Zach, about what are the powers of that chief executive. But, of course, this will be studied. And if it passed, it would be several years in the future that this would actually be implemented. I want to thank you all so much for this conversation. It's been great. Michael Alvarez, thank you so much.
Thank you, Larry.
From Caltech. Sarah Sidwani from Pomona College.
Thank you.
Zachary Corriser from Claremont McKenna College. And thank you for coming out this evening to our Crawford Family Forum at LAist 89.3. I remind you that all of these ballot measures can be found in depth in the voter game plan, laist.com/vote. You'll have an opportunity to also hear all of our AirTalk interviews that are done in depth on each of the ballot measures. We have both of the candidates for LA County District Attorney, long interviews with them as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a terrific rest of your day. Right. Well, we're going to get to the Q&A portion, and for those of you watching the live stream, we welcome you as well. It's so great to have you with us from home, and it's just like you're part of our capacity audience here at the Crawford Family Forum. So very nice to have you with us, too. So we have a microphone here. If you'd like to come up to the microphone, I want to reiterate what I said at the opening. Questions only, and very succinct, please. No politicking. Pretend it's a voting location. So no politicking. But if you have a question for our experts, this is a great chance for you to dig down a little deeper into the ballot proposition. So just come on up. Whoever's first, we give you extra points for being brave. Come right on up, your first name and where you're from, and we'll get started with your question, please. And this is Peyton Seda, by the way, one of our producers on AirTalk, who does such a great job. And our senior producer, the man who runs all of AirTalk, Matthew D'Angelantonio, seated right here. Absolutely essential. So, sir, your first name and where you're from, please.
My name is David. I'm from Angelino Heights.
Great.
Thank you so much for doing this, Larry. I really love this. But my question was in regards to Prop 36, and just in terms of clarification, you see a lot of the memes and a lot of the social media, and I've heard a lot of people make the argument about Prop 36 that our felony threshold is at 950, but you see all these red states that have a much higher threshold. But my understanding was that the states that have a higher threshold in terms of felony versus misdemeanor, there's also, they have 3 strikes laws, or, where there's some sort of bar where it's going to become a felony. And I was just wondering if you could say if is there a across the board
So what's comparable in other states? you're
exactly,
asking?
yeah.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. Any of the three of you have? Yeah,
No,
Zach?
no, but I'd extend something I was trying to say earlier about 36 in the sense that, we talked about, Michael was talking about, for example, some things that shouldn't be on the ballot. Now, I don't think this shouldn't be on the ballot, but I do think this raises some certain complexities, right? In terms of, it's really hard to tell cause and effect in terms of sentencing, in terms of what effects that our laws are going to have, in terms of, reducing crime, getting crime off the streets, because that's what everyone wants, of course. And, this is a blunt tool. And I think there's a lot of confusion about, first off, what's caused this and how to fix it. And is an initiative the best way of going about it? And
But of course, Prop 47 was an initiative, so it's an initiative countering an initiative.
I understand that, but at the same time, I wonder if this is going to be fought on sort of facts and understanding, or if it's going to be fought on what we see in the headlines and the things that we associate with the feeling we have about crime, rather than the reality.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming tonight. All right, your first name and where you're from, please.
GT from Encino. I drove all the way here.
Very good.
Thank you for this opportunity. My question is about Proposition 33. I heard Sarah so bravely shared with us what she feels on Proposition G, which you said you were going to be, well, how you felt about it. I'm very passionate about the rent control proposition because I feel that it's going to hurt more people than it will ever hurt people. I've given speeches, I've done
Can I
some
just
work on
interrupt
it.
you there because
And-
I need you to get to your question, please.
Okay, so could you maybe share with us, is it allowed to tell us how your personal feeling is? Because I heard the 26% that's undecided. Is there
If
anything?
I'd rather they not be put on the spot for that. If they choose to say it as a part of the conversation, I'm okay with that. But when we invited them, it wasn't to actually give their personal opinion because they're academics. So I appreciate you asking that, and I'm curious too. But I wouldn't feel comfortable asking them. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming tonight. I appreciate it. Yeah. Your first name?
My name is Ann, and I'm from Sylmar. And I'd like to ask some question about Proposition 5 with the housing.
Yes,
and the lack of-
lowering the threshold
Yes.
for passage, yes.
And maybe this is just terribly naive. Been accused of that before. It's so expensive to build housing that's proper for people to live in. And I just wonder why we can't do something like, I'm sure there's some unhoused people who are in the construction business who could participate in the building of these houses. Perhaps something like Habitat for Humanity.
Let me just interject. One of the issues is, and our experts can correct me if I have this wrong, but with many of these programs, they're compelled to use union labor. So they can't use people who are unhoused as a part of the workforce because they've committed that they will only hire construction crews that are unionized. And that takes there's a whole apprentice and a whole system to get into the union.
And I have another question about
Okay,
that.
Okay.
Then why not apprentice? Can't you be an apprentice working on the housing and learning
Yes.
it and becoming a union member? Because
Yes, and the unions do have apprentice programs, and I'm not familiar with how they operate or how many people who are attempting to get in the union they have in the apprentice programs, but they do have them, I know.
But-
But who know? I don't know if they're family members who end up in the apprentice programs or unhoused people. I don't know who gets in. All right. I'm sorry. Anybody else want to add to that, Sarah?
You know, I was just going to add, because I do so appreciate the question. A recent deep dive done by the New York Times really looked at the contraction of the construction industry nationwide following the recession back in 2007, 2008, and argued, excuse me, that we've never really recovered from it. So our capacity to even build out as much housing as we actually need simply may not be there. And it should be an opportunity for more people to get into the construction industry, but that takes time. And so it seems like there is this lag of the actual construction industry to be able to build the amount of housing stock that we need.
And under Measure HHH in Los Angeles, if I'm not mistaken, the per unit cost is over $700,000 to build a unit, one unit for someone. Because of I mean, there's so many land acquisition or converting of current structures, union wages, and I don't say that to be anti-union, but it's all built into the cost of building those units. Zach?
Just one comment about fund. So there's no one solution to this problem. There's so many things that California has to be done. There's so many choke points and veto points in building housing in California. The legislature's been doing a lot. This is a piece of the puzzle, but I think one thing that we should remember is in terms of access to funding for affordable housing, cities used to have fairly generous redevelopment funds that came from the state for these kinds of purposes, and those have been gone for some time now. And so this opens up a revenue stream for cities who are committed and interested in building low-cost housing in their cities to have an available income stream for doing so. And, in terms of where we should set the level, the last three housing bonds that were similar would have passed under this measure were Berkeley in 2022, where it was 59% of the vote, San Diego 58% of the vote, East Palo Alto 65% of the vote. So
Just shy.
just shy. So there's
Wow.
the cities that are trying to open up this revenue stream, they're getting very close. I think this would be very helpful in terms of opening up that revenue stream that's just no longer there.
I'd
Michael?
also add that it's a great question, and thank you for raising it, because one of the things that might happen if this passes is that it will give local governments the opportunity to experiment quite a bit, I think alluding to what Zach just said. And with that experimentation, we might see efforts to create these kind of job programs that you're thinking about. But I would also add that keep in mind that these construction jobs are not easy jobs. I mean, they're difficult jobs. There's a reason why they're unionized, because they're not safe jobs. And so, it's not something we can easily put people into that kind of workforce, because they do need to be trained and they do need to be well protected by laws and with the help of their unions.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, and appreciate you coming. Yes, please.
My name's Babette. I'm from Mount Washington. I'm curious about two of the propositions, particularly 33 and 35. 33, will that wipe out the rent stabilized ordinance in the city of LA? And then 35, my friend who is basically stuck in a bed and is dependent on Medicare, Medi-Cal help, and she doesn't always get the proper help, and she can't walk barely to the bathroom, and she's 70 years old. So what will happen to the rent stabilized ordinance, and what will happen to my girlfriend's health care,
All right.
home health care?
Thank you. Thank you. Both such good questions. On 33 and the repeal of Costa-Hawkins, it does not repeal local rent control ordinances. So they would all be in effect, but they could be expanded if Costa-Hawkins is repealed with that. Anything else to add on that?
I would just add that there's this 1995 trigger of Costa-Hawkins, right? So my understanding of the LA City Ordinance is it applies to those units that were built prior to 1995. If this were to pass, they could potentially pass rent stabilization for buildings after 1995.
All right. And the other was about the Proposition 35 and making the tax permanent, and those concerned that home health care will be cut out of this process for the big providers.
This is the argument of the opposition. And I think there's some very legitimate groups that are a part of it. I look at the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network. They really think about a whole variety and host of Californians who need this kind of access. And one of the major concerns that they raise is that it would continue to limit the ability of Medi-Cal users to be able to get the in-home care in particular. So that seems like it would actually potentially be impacted were Prop 35 to pass.
And this gets to the issue I think you raised at the LA Times endorsement, because I think they're concerned, the Times editorial board was opining that the concern was it wouldn't give the state legislature budget flexibility to figure out, okay, we need so much for home health care, we need so much for Medi-Cal provider reimbursement, we need, to deal with that on a year-by-year basis. So thank you for that. I think for those of the three of you in line, we'll be able to take all three of you, and then I think we'll wrap our questions after the three of you that are standing. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Bill from Pasadena, and my question revolves around the affordability of the $20 billion in bond issues. If you or I were to buy a house or a home, the first thing we look at is, can we afford it? Do we have enough income? And you mentioned, I think we'd have about $800 billion to repay in interest only. And my question is, can the state of California, or putting it another way, are we increasing the amount of the budget we're spending on bond payment? Has there been any discussion of that? Have you looked at that?
Yeah, it's a very good issue that you raise. The proponents that we've had on AirTalk for the bond measures claim that they call it underbonded, that's how they frame it, that in terms of the ability to bond versus the size of the budget, that our those that rate the bonds for the state don't see us as overly leveraged through bonds, and that there's plenty more borrowing capacity. That's what the proponents say. The opponents say, you're borrowing during high interest time. You mentioned that what is the $800 million repayment just for the bonds that we're talking. Yeah, so we're talking about a significant amount of debt to take on, and some of the opponents say typically this is for projects that are capital projects. You're paying off like a house, something you're going to be in for years, but not all of this necessarily falls under capital. So, including some of the climate mitigation one. Not all of that is the typical kind of bond-oriented funding. So anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, we had a massive deficit this past year. The budget deficit over 2 years was $56 billion, I believe was the number. And you have to remember that many of these bonds are being referred to us by the legislature. And so they're not seeking to try to do this out of, the general fund. There's a side of this to where the legislature is basically saying, do you want to pay for this, voters, right? And there's a positive way to look at that in the sense that we get to decide, and there's a negative sense in the sense that it is very costly to budget using bonds. And is this the most efficient way to go about doing this? But I think it's really become more of a political question. And it's not the first time, like looking at, for example, this is just, we've been doing this for a while. We're in a habit of filling up this fund to repair school facilities via bonds and via the initiative process. This is what what California has become accustomed to in terms of funding facilities. So it's not out of the ordinary. I think it's continuing in a tradition in many ways, but it's also a way in which the legislature is both taking this off their legislative plates and putting it on ours, but also giving us the opportunity to say yes or no.
Well, I think you also have to consider this in terms of the investment that we're making. Okay, so these bond measures are going to create jobs. Okay, they're going to perhaps, with respect to the climate mitigation measure, prevent huge climate disasters. I mean, just to
I'm just wondering, are we increasing, for example, the percentage of our budget that we're spending on the
well, I think we
annual
are
payment?
Yeah.
underfunded at this point in terms of that. But again, these are going to generate tax revenues as well. Okay, so the way to think about this is that they're going to generate revenue, they're going to generate investments in things like public education. We're educated, we're going to build new schools, we're going to air condition the schools, we're going to make sure that kids who are in public schools are going to have a more quality education.
And in
That's
terms of the percentage of the budget, which is an excellent question, one of the problems is we don't know what the revenue is going to be in coming years. And even the state budget analyst as we've seen, has had a very difficult time, landing the plane even close to the runway and what's projected. They've been off by so much, and these are very bright people who are but have had a very tough time. So that is the question that's laid at the feet of voters here, is do you think that revenues are going to climb enough that it's going to make investment like this make sense financially and the overall benefit? So thank you. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Next question, and then one more after that. So that was your question? He stole that? Okay, all right. All right, thank you. Go right ahead.
My name's Tony from La Cañada here. Speaking of budget impacts, one of them that we know from past history is sales tax. As it gets increased, the people most impacted tend to be the poorest because their cost of living goes directly up and they can at least afford it. In the same sense here, Proposition 32, when you increase income to the workers, that has to be passed through. So, the proverbial McDonald's hamburger, it costs more. Have you done any study on that knock-on effect of this particular number 32? Thank you.
Sarah?
I haven't done any specific assessment of this measure itself, but as I mentioned previously, certainly there have been a number of analyses of the most recent proposition that did increase the minimum wage for fast food workers, and most certainly that led to an increase in prices. The cost of that McDonald's hamburger has increased. The cost of the Starbucks coffee has increased. And so this is one of the concerns that opponents raise anytime we talk about minimum wage, is that the downstream effect will be felt by ordinary consumers.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for coming out this evening. So appreciate having you here. All of us hope that it's been beneficial as you plan for your vote. And again, thank you. It'll air tomorrow morning at 10 in case you want to listen to it again. Thank you for coming out. Have a wonderful evening. And for our panel, please, let's thank them again. Zach Corser, Sarah Sidwani, Michael Alvarez. Have a very good night.